Hi, Mike. Welcome
Hi,
to part
Imran.
three.
Hi, Imran. Welcome. Yeah. Thing.
Um, yeah, continuing on from our last two podcasts, where we've been talking about our experiences with the carnivore diet. Um, Last week we finished saying that we would discuss the question of longevity and how we're looking at that.
hmm
Um, there was one other piece of housekeeping, if you like, from last week. There was another loop that was left open. One thing that we did discuss, or you brought up, was that you mentioned at a certain stage you felt like you'd been able to improve your body composition, get leaner, not through calorie counting, but through circadian timing. And that intrigued me because it's something I don't fully understand. So, could you give a bit of an explanation of what that meant?
Yeah, sure. So through my experience with cancer, become aware that shift work was predisposes people to a higher risk of cancer and also heart disease. And shift work's a disruption of basically something called a circadian rhythm. So a circadian rhythm is a biological rhythm with a that our body goes through of circa diem about 1 day. And that's what circadian means, about a day. So it can be a little bit less, it can be a little bit longer. It's not exactly 24 hours on the spot. And all of our biological systems seem to, when we operate in nature in the way that we maybe evolved to, all of those rhythms seem to operate nicely. So an example might be that we have secretion of cortisol that is higher in the morning, and cortisol being almost like a get up and go hormone. And that will be higher during the morning, and then in the evening it should be coming down on a natural basis. Likewise, our melatonin, which is associated with sleep and several functions during sleep, that starts rising towards the end of the day and then should be highest at night time and then start lowering in the morning when the cortisol starts rising up. So those two, I believe, are two that are in opposition to each other. Every single cell in the body has a circadian clock that understands that it's 24 hours. Even to the extent that you can put, there was an experiment. I read a lot about this in Sachin Panda's book, Circadian Code. Also some of Russell Foster's stuff. But these cells all have an individual clock that tells them roughly what 24 hours is. Our organs have the clocks, organ clocks, there's muscular clocks, and there's a master clock in the brain. The suprachiasmatic node, I think, is where that is. And that basically gets light in through the eyes. And that almost acts as a synchronizer for all the other clocks. So in theory, all of these systems, clocks are synced. You know, like when they have Mission Impossible or whatever, and they're all starting off and they all sync their watches to the same time. And so like this is something that should happen every day. And the master sinker is sunlight or daylight when we get up in the morning. But all the peripheral clocks, the ones in the muscles and the ones in the organs, are also influenced by what we do behaviorally. So when we eat influences the circadian rhythm of our organs, especially the digestive tract and any organs involved with digestion. Physical activity changes the rhythms of our muscles, but then also our body temperature potentially. Body temperature, like cortisol, should be up during the day and low at night. But if we exercise late at night, we raise our body temperature at night time, and we essentially move our rhythm backwards. So it's delayed, it's pushed back in time, which means we'll want to get up later, we want to go to bed later. What does this have to do with weight? Well, eating, it's presumed from what I've read in Sachin Panda's book, was that when we eat has an impact on what we do with that energy. So when it comes to weight loss, we've often been told it's calories in, calories out. That is maybe a high level physics thing. That's where it's at. But there's problems with dealing with that is that we don't determine what our appetite is going to be consciously, and we don't know what our body is actually doing with that energy when we get it. And so exercise, physical activity is just one form of energy, but thought is another. The brain uses a lot, and so do all the various systems in the body. And we have no control, no conscious control over what is getting done. So, for instance, recovery and regeneration of our cells takes energy, but we don't have conscious control over that. That's all determined whether that's going to get done behind the scenes. If we live in sync with our rhythms, whatever that means, then all the things get done properly, and our appetite will be regulated in a certain way, and how those calories that we take in will be apportioned and used in a particular way. But it seems that disruption of those circadian rhythms changes things on two fronts. Changes one, our appetite. So we know that if we interrupt our sleep, we then feel our appetite urges us to eat more than we actually need physiologically. So we will typically take on board more calories than we need to. But we don't know that because it feels like we need it, because our body is telling us we're hungry. So to all intents and purposes, we're eating what we feel we need. The other thing then is what is happening to those calories that we've taken on board. Well, we've potentially disrupted all the different type of work. If we eat late at night, that is the time that actually the digestive system should be repairing itself. And there's a process by which it goes through in 90-minute cycles of actually going through and purging the whole system and replenishing, almost regenerating the cells. And this is like a roughly, give or take, a 90-minute cycle. I can't remember the name of it, but there are other things that are supposed to be happening. Deep sleep, we're supposed to be getting physical regeneration. But if our melatonin levels are low, then our deep sleep won't be as high. Well, insulin spikes late at night basically repress melatonin. So also eating late at night means a lot of the work that melatonin is supposed to be doing doesn't get done. So I don't know for sure how, the actual mechanics of everything, but there were two key studies in the book that struck me. And these were equal calorie, equal macronutrient type diets. The one that I can remember the details of most was that they had 3 meals a day, equal, the meals all consisted of the same levels of protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So basically rules out any impact that might have. But the way it was done was that one group had 50% of their calories for breakfast, 25% for lunch, and 25% for dinner. The second group had the 50% for dinner and 25% for lunch and breakfast. So basically, the 50% meal was shunted. It was either at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day. Now, at the end of the study, I think it was about 12 weeks, there was the group that ate the big meal early had lost significantly more weight, even though the food was all calorie controlled for maintenance. I believe everyone was eating exactly the same calories, but one group had more weight loss than the other. In fact, one group didn't have any weight loss, one group did, and that was the group that ate in the morning. And it amounted to the equivalent of actually as if they were eating 500 calories a day less.
Wow. So typically in the West, we would be in the other group eating most of our calories in the evening after work.
Yeah. So I thought, well, during lockdown, I'd by fortune read this book in the 3 months leading up to COVID, and had already started trying to put in place the principles. But I found I because of work and stuff, I was up late at night and this, that, and the other, and it was just work life timing was really difficult. And I was eating all sorts of rubbish, pizzas, chips, some healthy food, but I didn't, Chinese takeaways, there was all sorts. But in the space of practicing these circadian principles and adding in 10,000 steps walking, so potential confounder, but that was generally, most of that was done in the morning during lockdown, not consciously changing my diet, but just going with what I fancied. I ended up losing a stone over maybe 3 months. And I wasn't doing anything differently other than over time. It took me about a month to actually get my rhythms back, because I was going to bed at 2-3 o'clock in the morning, getting up at 10-11 in the morning. So I eventually managed to shift that to going to bed 11 o'clock, getting up about 6:30, 7 o'clock. I would get up, go for maybe an hour's walk or something, come back, maybe do some other exercise or whatever, then have a late breakfast. I would then make sure that I would typically only eat 2 meals a day and only felt like I needed to. I would make sure that I ate at least 3 hours. I finished eating at least 3 hours before I went to bed. So I had to have finished by 8 o'clock. And I typically try to do 7 o'clock. And by that, just by timing, I was able to lose a stone in weight. I mean, yes, I was walking, but I'd also previously been playing a lot more squash and doing a lot of other things. So in terms of actual physical activity, calories in and out, I was probably doing less, if anything, because I couldn't go and play squash. But who knows? But it was just interesting that timing was an issue. And that reminded me as well of looking at intermittent fasting. Michael Mosley had done years ago a panorama thing on fasting, and he looked at 4 different protocols. This is where his 5-2 protocol came from, was on the back of him doing this documentary. And at one university, they were doing alternate day fasting. And it was one day of having 25% of your normal calorific needs, but with greens and very low carb foods. So like they were drinking miso soup and stuff like that. On the day in between, they were going to fast food outlets. And Michael Mosley was asking about that. Well, surely we still want to eat clean and eat good, healthy food and stuff like that. And the researchers said, yeah, we thought that as well. But interestingly, we seem to be getting better results when people are able to eat as they want on that day off, and then do that alternate day fasting. That's the results they found in terms of, they were looking particularly at insulin and insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1. Those were the 2 main things they were looking at, if memory serves me correctly. So even then, from watching that documentary, this idea of timing made a difference. And yes, for myself, I proved that. I've also known that now when I track back, all my periods of weight gain have been when I was at university. I was drinking and eating late at night. When I've worked late and I've eaten carbs late at night, this is what got me onto carnivore. I was eating bowls of cereal late at night and I piled on 3/4 of a stone really quickly. Interestingly, my experience with carnivore is that I can eat carnivore late and that hasn't impacted me. And that may be because of the difference in insulin levels, that protein doesn't fire up the insulin as heavily. so it doesn't maybe disrupt the circadian rhythm as much. That's just a theoretical thought, I guess, from my
Very
part.
interesting. Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I think this is something that I've been exploring a little bit myself recently, looking at Jack Cruise's work, but I haven't got a thorough understanding of it at the moment. I have been experimenting with eating earlier in the evening, so trying to leave 3 hours before, 3 hours time in between finishing my meal and going to bed, and having more calories earlier in the day. Interestingly, last night I finished work late. I hadn't eaten since very early in the morning. I ate some food quite late at night, much later than I normally would. Woke up feeling
Uh,
absolutely terrible. Woke up feeling really tired.
I was
and
going to ask whether you'd noticed an impact on your sleep. Yeah,
yeah, felt really tired, and I felt hungry as soon as I woke up, even though I'd eaten about an hour before I went to sleep.
yeah,
Um, so it's a pretty easy thing for people to experiment with. It's very low risk. I think it's definitely worth trying, just shifting that meal timing earlier.
yeah. I think one of the other key takeaways, and the other study that I can't remember all the details of, but the key takeaway from Sachin Panda's book was the eating window. So he suggests initially a window of 12 hours, that our first sip or mouthful of calories to our last sip or mouthful of calories is completed within a 12-hour window. Through the research that he's doing on his site, and he's basically, people can go along to his site and sign up and basically send food photos and this, that, and the other, time logs of when they eat, etc. He came to the conclusion, what he was finding, that people were generally eating over a 15-hour window. So their first bite to their last bite would be spread over 15 hours, leaving 9 hours for the body to do the rest of what it needed. Just by going to 12 hours, people have seen health improvements and even sometimes weight loss. And some people, if you take it even further to 10, 8 or 6 hours as your eating window, again, people can see bigger benefits, not just from weight loss, but things like arthritis. So we talk about arthritis being a wear and tear thing, but now I've seen mention that it's potentially a metabolic issue. But I also believe there's a circadian element to this as well, because Sachin Panda details in his book that bone rebuilding takes place at certain times during the day. Now, if we disrupt those rhythms, we potentially are disrupting the repair and rebuilding of our bones and our joints. And that is more likely to lead to what we call arthritis. So to boil it down into things, and this is what's really difficult for Western society, as you mentioned, we should be eating and being physical during the day and resting at night.
Yeah. I used to
Is what
train,
it
as
boils
many
down
people
to.
do, straight after work. I'd hit the gym. That takes up a fair amount of time, and then eat late, and
Yeah.
my sleep just deteriorated to the point where
Mm-hmm.
I rarely got a good night's sleep. And one of the things that has largely fixed that is training before work. I do my main physical exertion
Yeah.
first thing in the morning, or sometimes I break it up into small amounts. Instead of doing an hour in the gym, as the sort of typical workout time seems to be 45 minutes for an hour, sometimes I'll do 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at lunchtime, and 10 minutes in the evening. And it's just the workout that would have been done in one block spread over the
Yeah.
day. And I find that way better.
Yeah.
It keeps your energy levels up during the day,
Mm-hmm.
rather than you having this big peak of exertion and then dragging, feeling fatigue later on.
Yeah. I
So
think
either of
that's,
those things.
yeah. And I think that probably is more in tune with how we evolved and how creatures in the wild live. You know, if you're a diurnal creature, you're awake during the day and asleep at night, you typically will do all your physical activity during the day, and
Mm,
you potentially eat maybe sort of towards the evening when you're feeling a little bit safe and you've done all your stuff. But then when the dark comes, well, you can't see. Yes, we developed fire, but even still, it was still a lot lighter, or sorry, darker in that sense, but you'd be resting and you'd be telling stories and stuff and maybe reflecting or whatever. We wouldn't be out and about doing stuff.
You wouldn't be in an artificially lit
Potentially.
gym doing a CrossFit workout at 8 p.m.
No. Or as I tend to do, team squash, for instance. I play in local squash leagues, and the matches generally start at 7 o'clock at night to allow everyone to finish work, get there. They could go on for upwards of 2 hours. So the last person might be going on at court at 9 o'clock, 9:30 even, going full on at probably 85% plus of VO2 max for the duration of the match. And then what do? We sit down and have a couple of pints of beer and a meal. 10 o'clock at night at the earliest. And so I find that on those days, my sleep and my energy the next morning is absolutely horrible. So much so that every year I have a battle in my head. Do I do team squash again? Because of it does have an impact on my overall health and being able to maintain my health during the season. Can I play my squash competitively? Can I somehow start a daytime league at the weekends or something like that? Yeah.
That would make much more sense.
Yeah.
Shall we move back onto carnivore as a whole? So as promised at the beginning, I'm sure you've had this experience. I know I certainly have. When family and friends notice that the only thing on your plate when you go out for a meal or if they come around to your house is meat, and the immediate reaction seems to be, what on earth are you doing? Don't you know that red meat will finish you off prematurely one way or another? So these kinds of headlines and news reports have been around for a long time. It's nothing new. Things like red meat causes cancer, bowel cancer, weight gain, shortens lifespan. There seems to be a new one of these studies that crops up almost on a schedule a few times a year, and they often come out quite prestigious organizations like Harvard. They get published, widely reported on in the news. So I think it's almost as though many people would assume this to be fact at this point. And when they see somebody who's eating a predominantly meat diet, might not be 100%, but a high amount of meat, particularly red meat, they think that we've gone absolutely crazy. Have you experienced this reaction?
Totally. Not quite as extreme, but a lot of people like, isn't that bad for you? Don't you need the fiber? What about bowel cancer, colon cancer, that type of stuff? I think people have lost sight of where it's come from, but like you say, we've had these studies, and I think this goes back to the infamous Ansel Keys days, and there's loads of videos on YouTube talking about all of that stuff. But this idea that high fat diets, high saturated fat diets cause heart disease. But I think you've got some details of studies around that and stuff, and how they're based on observation of what people eat. But these observations are people writing down what they've eaten, maybe in a food diary, or maybe a few researchers have gone out there and saying, oh yeah, look at heart disease in this society and look at the amount of red meat they eat. Oh, one goes up with the other. Well, it sounds great, but like you say, kid as they get older gets bigger and they're more likely to get disease. So does getting bigger mean you get disease? Not necessarily. So correlation and causation. I think you've got a bit more that you want to talk about this, but the amount of confounding factors in there. So you go ahead, Imran.
Yeah. So how do we know anything in nutrition? Unlike many other forms of research, the human body is incredibly complex. It's very, very difficult to tie down a single variable and make a controlled experiment which shows what the effects are of that variable. Almost impossible, I would say. So if we take something as simple as a common nutrient that we know about, like vitamin C, if we wanted to test the effects of vitamin C at different doses, let's say one group of people has 500 milligrams, another group has 1,000 milligrams. For that to be a genuinely controlled experiment, we'd need to control every other single factor in these people's lives. And we'd need to start with sets of identical twins so that we know that they're genetically exactly the same. So we'd
Yeah.
need a large number, let's say 1,000 sets of identical twins. One side has 500 milligrams, the other side has 1,000. We'd need to put them in a completely controlled environment, which I very much doubt anyone's going to agree to. It's not really very ethically sound either. And control everything that happens. We'd have to control not just all the other food that they eat, we'd have to control exposure to light, what time they get up, their stress levels. How do we control stress levels? Can we control what they're thinking? Can we control their emotions?
Exactly. So, yeah.
My point is, obviously, I'm taking this to an extreme, but my point is, we can't really carry out controlled experiments in the world of nutrition, and I don't think people realise how grey some of these guidelines are. So we have things like the RDAs for micronutrients, and these are our best estimates. These are not facts. There's many other circumstances which can affect them. So the types of studies that we see that have these really attention-grabbing headlines, these are normally epidemiology. They're population studies where they've looked at a group of people, they've identified a few trends, and they've tried to extrapolate why these trends, for example, how much red meat they eat, lead to an end result. So for every one of these studies that says, for example, red meat will shorten your lifespan, you can probably find another study that's going to say the opposite. So I'll just share my screen briefly.
Yep.
Okay, so can you see this?
Yep.
Got that?
People in Hong Kong. Yeah.
People in Hong Kong. So people in Hong Kong have the longest life expectancy in the world. Some possible explanations. Interestingly, people in Hong Kong also have the highest meat consumption in the world. So the country that has the highest longevity in the world also has the highest meat consumption. So I'm not saying that it's the red meat that causes them to live longer, but here's just a clear example of something that completely contradicts the idea that red meat shortens lifespan.
Yeah.
Recently, there's been quite a few studies coming out which have been looking at red meat in a different context, but they haven't really achieved the same level of publicity. So here's one. I'm not going to go through every single one, but there's many out there if you start looking for them. Meat eating extends human life expectancy worldwide. Has eating meat become unfairly demonized as bad for your health? So a couple of lines from here. The researchers found that consumption of energy from carbohydrate crops does not lead to greater life expectancy, and total meat consumption correlates to greater life expectancy. Okay. While detrimental effects of meat consumption on human health have been found in some studies in the past, the methods and findings in these studies are controversial and circumstantial. So my point is here, you can find these types of population studies that will go either way. And it really just comes down to the amount of confounding factors, the amount of things that we can't control. Some of these studies are actually, they actually disappear into absurdity, really. There's people out there like Zoe Harcum. I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this subject, having a look at her website, or perhaps Chris Kresser. And they take the time to go through these studies when they come out and pick them apart and publish articles on their sites where you can have a closer look. unfortunately, most people are only ever going to see the headline. They're probably not going to go as far as looking through the study in detail, and might not understand how to pick the study apart. So having a look at some of these resources. So this was one which came out just at the end of last year, which caused a big fuss, came out of Harvard. Red meat and type 2 diabetes. The study was saying that red meat increases your risk of diabetes, which anyone who knows some basics of nutrition will think that's odd, because diabetes is an illness related to insulin management, and red meat doesn't really spike insulin that much. So what's the connection there? So just to pick out a couple of points from here, from Zoe Hartcomb's analysis, she said, this makes no sense from the outset, as diabetes is a glucose handling issue and meat contains no glucose. It would be more obvious to suspect the buns, fries, fizzy drinks, and hot dogs that are consumed with the burger. When we look closely at how the study was carried out, and this is typical of these types of studies, and it's not quality research at all, the definition of red meat actually included sandwiches and lasagna, presumably because sometimes these foods have a small amount of red meat. As far as I know, sandwiches and lasagna are pretty heavy in carbohydrates. Is it not more likely that that is what's affecting your insulin? And I believe this study didn't actually include levels of sugar consumption. So somehow they managed to zero in on red meat causing an increased risk of type 2 diabetes without looking at the level of sugar that these people were consuming. So just to really hammer the point home, here's one more.
Go on.
Sure, you go ahead if you want.
Well, I was going to say, linked to that, there's two things that sprung to mind. Was our combining of meat and starchy carbs. Ben Bickman, in one of his videos, he's very much talks about insulin and its effect on long-term chronic disease, and says, rightly, well, he's the scientist, the researcher, talks about the insulin that's secreted when you eat carbs may be up there. The insulin when you secrete protein may be down here. But if you eat the two together, the insulin secreted goes way, way higher. So this is, I think we mentioned it in the chat beforehand. We study individual variables, but not necessarily the combinations of variables. And so I think on the insulin thing, it may be our cultural predisposition to match those two together. Because if I eat meat, there's a famous diet from the 70s or 80s, the Scarsdale diet, and it was basically steak and green veg. Paleo was very much the same. You don't have starchy carbs, you have meat and vegetables, but non-starchy carbs. So avoiding the insulin spiking carbs with the protein. If you're going to have the carbs, have them on their own. So that was, and all the communities around the world that are healthy on high carb diets are typically high carb, low fat, low protein diets. And so there's something about that mixing of those macronutrients.
Yeah.
And then just one more related to that is we can't ignore the business influence on all of this. So sure, the meat industry is a big industry, but plant-based food, processed food dwarfs it massively in terms of the amount of food that gets sold, the chemicals, the factories, everything across the board is massive. So when you look at nutritional research, how much of it is done by Nestle, by Coca-Cola, by Procter and Gamble, all these types of people, who's funding the nutritional research is the other side of things.
Yeah. So meat doesn't particularly have a high profit margin, whereas foods made from grains and sugar can be made into 1,000,001 different things that have a much, much higher profit margin, which I imagine is why these industries are much bigger. And you've only got to look at the food pyramid and see what is being recommended as at the base of the pyramid is mostly grains. And if you look into a little bit look into a little where those recommendations come from, highly influenced by the industries that would benefit from
Yes.
them.
Yeah. Very much so.
So I'll just mention this one other study because I think it's quite funny. It's this is another longevity study, and it was an article that was published, I think, in the Times first of all, that pointed out that people in Spain have one of the highest levels of longevity in the world. It's heading towards the top, and it's certainly higher than in the UK. Yet their levels of smoking are about double the UK, and they drink more. So, looking through this article, it tried to say that it must be the benefit of the Mediterranean diet that's offsetting the increased level of smoking and drinking. So this is the kind of nonsense that's out there that it only takes a little bit of thinking to see through. That can't be proven at all. How do we know that it's not actually the smoking and drinking that's making these people live longer? It's just an assumption based on we think that the Mediterranean diet is better than the British diet. So these kinds of studies, they're just cloudy, lots of uncontrolled, different circumstances, and people are looking at them and basically drawing conclusions that can't really be proven.
Yeah. I think it also goes to show, unfortunately, the not the narrow-mindedness, but the siloed thinking of researchers. Because they're researching diet, the only other factors they can think of, they're trying to attribute everything to diet. There was a similar finding in an American mining town we've talked about before, Rosito, and I came across this in a book, Anti-Cancer Living. And it was so important that they put this effect on our health as the first of all the things that we should look at. But if I tell you about the background was American mining town, Italian-American community, drink, smoke, they're down the mines every day, doing everything possibly that they could do wrong. Very similar to the mining towns in the region. Similar climate, same sort of drinks and cigarettes and all of that sort of stuff going on, yet next to no levels of heart disease in comparison to the neighbouring towns. And this became known as the Rosito effect. Now, two doctors got together to talk about this, and they theorised that it was actually the community. They theorised that actually there was a very strong social connection in this community. The wealthy lived with the poor, everybody helped each other, supported each other, knew each other. And they theorized that as that community would break down, that levels of heart disease would go up. And in essence, that's what they found over the next few decades. So what you were talking about in that Mediterranean study, well, one thing I'm pretty sure when I've spent time over there, or when I look at sort of TV programs about it and all, they are still more family and community oriented. A lot of their meals and drinking and smoking is done in big family groups together. It's not, the smoking isn't done on the doorstep of your office trying to get, de-stress for 5 minutes before you go back in. They have big family meals together. They also have the sunshine, stuff like that. There's so many different factors. But that social connection is something that comes out in the Blue Zones work as well. And exactly why we can't assume, we can't infer from any epidemiological study that one thing is the cause of another. You're spot on with that.
Yeah. So I think research that's looked at centenarians and supercentenarians and the factors that may play into their longevity tends to come to similar conclusions. And yes, they do think that diet is a part of it, but the overall lifestyle is hugely important. Diet isn't the only factor in longevity. And things that do come up time and again are that sense of community, but also having a sense of purpose. So I think a lot of older people lose their sense of purpose when they retire. But if you are connected to your family, not locked away in an old people's home somewhere, forgotten about.
Yeah.
If you have that connection with the wider society, and you have with the wider community, and you have something that's keeping you going mentally, I'm pretty sure that's a huge factor as well.
Yeah.
There's other factors, physical factors like strength and activity, which probably another whole subject that we could dig into at another
Hmm.
time. Um, but once we start to open this out and think about the other effects, the other things that could be affecting our health, I think we also actually need to think about what are we talking about when we're talking about health? What is our definition of it?
Yeah.
So if you spend the last 10 or 15 years or even longer um, pretty much housebound or in a home where you're not moving around very much, you're not able to move around physically, you might be kept alive by a whole batch of medications that you're taking daily. What's the quality of life there? So I think we have to be quite clear on what we're talking about. Yes, longevity has gone up in a lot of the Western world, but we have to also take into account quality of life and think about what it is that we're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah. Are
Um,
you
I,
are you aware of a measure called health span?
yes, yeah,
So when I did a couple of talks after I had cancer, and I got health span statistics, and this is going back 15 years, 14 years now. Um, got health span statistics from the ONS, and at that stage, lifespan, predicted lifespan was increasing, but health span was actually stationary or actually even going backwards for women. So health span being the time independent of medical care, I'm guessing, roughly speaking. And for men at the time, it was 61. So our life expectancy was in the 80s, and health expectancy was in the very low 60s. And for women, it was stuck at 60, and it hadn't progressed. And I think it actually gone down a little bit. And I think that was potentially influenced by more women smoking at the time, but may also be more women going into the workplace as well, stuff like that. But yeah, you're right. What is health? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for you?
yeah. I like to take a very simple approach to things. So I have been down the rabbit hole in the past of looking at blood work and thinking about getting some preemptive blood work done so that we can have an idea of things that might be lurking in our future. Um, but even that, once you start to look into it closely, there's a great deal of unknowns there. We could take the cholesterol example. Um, that's something that we've focused on for many years, and gradually over time, that the thinking on cholesterol has morphed and changed. Um, this is another huge subject, but it's looking like some of the recommendations that have been given out for the last few decades are um, are controversial to say the least, and could be
Yeah,
altogether wrong. Could have actually done more harm than good. So that's something I'm wary of. As I said, I like to take a very simple approach to things, and really, it's how I feel on a day-to-day basis. Um, I like, I'm a big fan of movement, exercise, training, and I like to feel that I have the energy to do a certain level of physical exertion regularly. I've set myself goals that I'd like to be able to maintain well into later life. And if I feel like I'm on the right track for that, if I feel like when I wake up in the morning I've got energy, um, I'm not gaining an unreasonable amount of weight. Those are my simple markers. Yeah, how do you think about it?
yeah, it's how I feel and what I can do on a day-to-day basis, and so much so that through my cancer and my back operation, I was severely restricted in what I was capable of doing. So during cancer, a lot of the time, especially after the chemotherapy, I was like, I couldn't walk up one flight of stairs without stopping for a break. And that is what I see in like my dad now in his 80s. You know, he struggles going up the stairs. He has to take it really, really slowly, and then he has to sit down at the top. Now he's got various conditions going on. I obviously had the chemo affecting me. Now I can walk up flights and flights of stairs. Yes, it you know, it gets me out of breath, etc. But I can keep going, and I can go at a pace that can keep going. Um, I want to be able to play squash. I want to be able to go swimming. I want to be able to run and jump, as well as sit and be mentally have the mental focus to be able to sit down and do work, plan for podcasts and, you know, training courses and stuff like that. And so now I've not only is it this, I think this is something that very few people do. They plan for their financial health in retirement, but they don't plan for their physical and mental health in retirement. And it's just almost assumed that it is what it is. But we know that the stronger you are and the more aerobically fit you are, the less likely you are to die of any cause in over a given time period. We know that if you are lonely, you are more likely to suffer depression, illnesses, stuff like that. But these are all things that we can plan for in our old age. But how many people are lonely in their old age and can't climb up a flight of stairs or can't get down on the floor and stand up again? So at a minimum, for me now is like on a day-to-day basis, I need to keep doing those basics. I need to be able to get up off the floor, get up. For me, it's still playing squash. I still want to improve as a squash player and be better at 60 than I am now. I'm 57 now. Be better at, can I be better at 70? That's a goal I have in my mind. I don't know whether it's possible. Can I build physically to then? I did an impromptu VO2 max test, just a 12-minute run, and I'm around 38, 39. But I know I could potentially, at times in my past, have been at 50, 50 plus. Can I gradually build that up to 50 plus and improve my risk of my mortality risk? So what do you want to be able to do when you grow old? Do you want to be able to play with your grandchildren? Do you want to be able to carry on playing football? Do you want to sit in an armchair riddled with arthritis? I think something that was really sad. I saw a couple of summers ago. I was at the tennis club and there was this family sat and they were having a picnic on the grass. And then I'm assuming the kids' grandparents and the adults' parents came along, but they couldn't join them because they couldn't sit on the ground with them. And they ended up going 10, 15 meters away to sit on a bench whilst the family stayed on the floor on the picnic. And I just thought that was so sad. I mean, yes, the family could have just moved to the picnic, to the bench, but you couldn't sit and have the picnic in front of the bench because it was tarmac and concrete. And it was just like, I want to be in a state where I can have that picnic with my grandchildren, that they can climb all over me or whatever. Not that I'm going to have grandchildren, but that's what I want. I would want, and what I would assume other people would like to have. And I think everyone can have that. Maybe not everyone, but the majority of people can have it if they put a little bit of thought into it.
Yeah, it's worth thinking about what we consider normal. So
Yeah,
if you look around and most of the old people that you see are very limited in their mobility and on tons of medications and don't appear to have a great quality of life, you can assume that that's going to be your destiny as well. Um, I love watching documentaries about hunter-gatherer people, and when you see what some of the older people are capable of there,
yeah,
it's unbelievable.
yeah,
That they've hardly aged at all. So older members of tribes are often keeping up with the younger ones, even on hard physical activities, hunting, climbing trees, even. Um,
yeah.
there was one I watched recently of a pygmy tribe, and the old ladies were hiking up a hill. They didn't know how old they were, but
Yeah.
they could have been around 100 because they had great grandchildren. They had
Mm-hmm,
grandchildren who were adults,
mm-hmm.
and they were dancing in a way that I don't think I'd have kept up with them.
Yeah,
But the
amazing.
level of physical
Yeah,
fitness that they had at whatever age they were, but as great grandparents, was
yeah,
astounding. And that's what they consider normal.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think we do need to pay attention to that and not just fall into sort of society traps of going down the same roads
Yeah.
everybody else does just because that's what everybody else does.
And so that, I think that leads us interestingly, because we would started this third part was like, what are the long-term effects of carnivore? And we don't, we haven't got any Western studies yet that have looked at that, because we haven't, it's just something that's not been on our radar because meat's so unhealthy. There have been looks at the Inuit and the living in the Arctic, a couple other tribes, hunter-gatherer tribes. There's a comparison of the Maasai and the Akikue from around 1930s, I believe. But there is, I think we talked about it last time off screen about, well, when we look at the future, we also need to consider what's happening on the way to that future. And there has been one study done on carnivores, and I've got it here. It's a voluntary study. It was put out, a request on social media forums, carnivore forums, people who'd done carnivore for X months, blah, blah, blah. Can you come and answer these questions for us and do these things? So I'd like to go through that if you're all right with that. We've got a few minutes left.
100%, yeah, please do.
Because this goes directly to the whether an all meat based diet is unhealthy in the long term or not. We don't know at this moment in time, but I think what we'll see on here is really interesting. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share screen with you. Okay, so this is if I scroll to the top here.
I haven't got your screen share yet, I don't think.
All right, okay. Let me try that again. Screen. Oh, let's just do entire screen. Share. Okay.
Yeah, it's coming up now.
Right. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
So, behavioural characteristics and self-reported health status among 2029 adults consuming a carnivore diet. So, right from the off, I'm going to say this doesn't prove causation at all. It is self-reported. It's, in terms of quality, it's not an interventional diet. There are a few other comments to make about it, but it's basically people who've been doing carnivore and they're happy to talk about it. So in the conclusions, just very, very briefly, contrary to common expectations, adults consuming a carnivore diet experienced few adverse effects and instead reported health benefits and high satisfaction. Cardiovascular disease risk factors were variably affected, and I'll come to those in a bit. The generalizability of these findings and the long-term effects of dietary pattern require further study. Fair enough. But I'd like to scroll down to a couple of charts. So these were just the participants. This was the frequency of food and intake, and basically the darker shadows show the percentages, the high percentages. So we see here red meat, 46% had it daily, and then we had these percentages that had it almost never, each meal, that sort of stuff. Fruits and veg, you can see that it was very low. So there was some fruit and veg on it as a whole, but high percentages, never had it. Then if we go, so this is the first one. These are some of the feelings that people felt. So if I try and explain this a little bit. So this column of bars here, these are the people, the percentage of people who reported that they felt better in this particular category than before the diet. The middle one is that they were unchanged, and the black one is where they were worse. So chronic disease, 69% suggested that they were better after the diet or whilst doing carnivore than before it. 30% suggested they were unchanged. 1 suggested that they were worse. Overall health, 95% of people doing it felt they were better off than before. Again, 1 person felt worse. And you can see, if we just go down all of these factors, the numbers down the right-hand side, these are the people who felt that it was worse. And the numbers down the left-hand side, these are the people who felt better. We're looking at hunger and food cravings, mental clarity, memory, focus, sleep, strength, endurance, energy. Now, it's self-reported, and observers who know their stats and stuff will say it's a biased community, because they are all still doing this, and we don't know whether there were another 2,000 people who started it and stopped. And those people maybe didn't want to take part or whatever. So there are issues with this, but there are a large number. 2,000 people is a decent number of people. And the majority of those 2,000 people are getting good benefits from it. Now, in terms of the longer term health, all of these things would suggest in the short term, I'm getting healthier. Chronic disease, overall health, mental clarity, focus, strength, endurance. We talked about strength, we talked about endurance. Those are all getting better for people. So it kind of, again, thinking about it, does it make sense that I could be getting healthier in the short term and then all of a sudden I'm going to drop dead because of something? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally. And then if we go down to another graph here. Okay, so this was chronic conditions and medication usage. And this for me is, again, another key one here. So there we go. So self-reported prevalence of and changes in chronic conditions and medication usage. So obesity and overweight. 928 people had suggested that they were obese and overweight. 52% of these felt that was resolved by going carnivore. 41% said it improved. 5% unchanged, 1% worsened. Underweight. So interestingly, the opposite one. 100 people who felt they were underweight. 52% resolved, 28 the same, 14% unchanged. 6 people worse. Lipid abnormalities, and I guess this comes from the blood tests, etc. Again, 27% resolved, 29% improved, 18% unchanged, 19 worsened, 8 who got abnormalities. This one's an interesting one for me. Diabetes and insulin resistance. 74% resolved, 24% improved, 1% unchanged.
Seems to contradict the article from earlier on.
Yeah, oh, massively so. And then we look at that, if we go jump from that diabetes one down to diabetes medications. So 29% were taking insulin, 52% of those were able to discontinue, and 38% were able to decrease their insulin. Okay, insulin for type 2, 92% were able to discontinue. 92%. Diabetes injectables, other. I'm not 100% sure of the details of this, but again, 16 of those, 100% of those, all 16 were able to discontinue their medication. 82 on oral diabetes medication. 84% of those were able to discontinue their medication. Now, don't get my understanding of the fear of red meat, it's going to cause cancer and heart disease. diabetes is highly correlated, that if you have diabetes, you have a much higher risk of getting cancer and heart disease. Yet these figures are suggesting that the risk of diabetes, or people are actually reversing their diabetes. Some have reversed it totally, and the others are reversing it. So in my mind, that's saying, well, is there not also a reduction in the risk of heart disease and cancer? I mean, if you look at these figures, they're all heavily biased to large numbers. I think the lowest number I see in this column is 36%, or 27 there, 12 here. So 27 for lipid abnormalities, autoimmune conditions. So only 36% of people going on this, out of these 2,000, reversed their autoimmune. Only 36. Another 53% said it improved.
And I think if we go back to the lipid abnormalities, that's a contentious subject. We don't know exactly what they're regarding as being abnormal.
Yeah. So there is actually somewhere along the line. So I think a lot of that will relate to LDL and HDL. Exactly. So if we come here, now I haven't fully understood this table as of yet, but what I can see is we've got LDLs, and if we just go current quarter one, 131, current quarter three, 237. So the LDLs have gone up during their carnivore time, and pre-diet we see there as well, 98. So I'm not sure what this Q1 and Q3, because it's gone up there as well, but Q1 here is a lot lower than Q1 here. Maybe that's quartile one. But LDL has gone up, and that is something we know from the research so far and the reported stuff, that tends to be the case. But what we also see is that if we look at the HDLs, pre-diet 45, current 57. Triglycerides, which we want to go down typically, pre-diet 58, current 50. So HDL has gone up, which we like, and triglycerides have gone down. Now there's the question of the LDLs. So I think even with, as you say, with the lipid abnormalities, more work goes into that. Dave Feldman's stuff. There's a talk about that. I have actually got, very briefly, on here. Can you see this now? YouTube.
Yep.
I'll just pause that, and if it comes up, I should be getting a summary, just a summary on here. So this was where they looked at levels of LDL and correlated it to buildup of plaque in the hearts, in the arteries. So that was using contrast, injection of contrast into the coronary arteries. Average LDL on keto, so they looked at people on a ketogenic diet, of which carnivore is a subset. So carnivore, often called ketovore, is typically ketogenic because it's zero carb. 272. They used a matching study for normal people, and that was 130. So when we come down to these insights, so metabolically healthy cohort of lean mass hyperresponders on a ketogenic diet did not have greater atherosclerotic burden than participants with similar risk profiles but lower LDL cholesterol, suggesting that metabolic health may play a significant role, i.e. the fact that these people were lean, their high LDL maybe wasn't an issue.
So they had no buildup of plaque in the arteries, although the LDL was higher.
The
higher LDL is the only thing that's standing out.
Yeah. So they were compared to a group of similar risk profile people who had low LDL cholesterol, and their plaque burden was exactly the same. So, and they had basically low plaque. So talks about scarcity there. The lipid hypothesis says LDL automatically causes more heart disease. Well, this study is showing that that's not that's not true, or that there is at least a caveat to that. That if you are lean, your LDL doesn't seem to affect you in the same way. With respect to carnivore, what we saw was the majority of people getting leaner. Let's just see that. So that was key insights there. If we go just up here, timestamp key insights. High HDL on a keto diet may not always lead to heart disease, but it is still important to monitor. So that's, yeah, and I think that's right. We still need to monitor that. If we go through here, high LDL on keto can lead to extreme increases in lean patients. High LDL cholesterol, with a study showing no significant differences in plaque compared to patients with lower LDL levels. High LDL on keto does not drive plaque in coronary arteries, as there is no direct relationship between LDL and plaque. But when combined with other factors like coronary calcium, it can increase cardiovascular risk. So the study found no significant difference in plaque between two groups. High LDL did not drive plaque development. High LDL alone does not necessarily increase cardiovascular risk. And I think those are the key things that we need to look at. What are those other things that add to the risk? Well, we've already talked, I think Peter Attia talks about high insulin levels. Well, we know we're not taking in any carbs on carnivore, so insulin levels are going to be low. Yeah. High levels of oxidation. Well, again, the fat is predominantly saturated or more saturated, so there's going to be less oxidation than there will be with the intake of polyunsaturated fats. So my current line of thinking is that longer term, what we've been told about red meat and heart disease doesn't stack up with what I currently understand. But that's to the knowledge of my competency and understanding of the science.
So let's just summarize that last piece, because we covered quite a lot of things in there. So we were looking at a self-reported study, because carnivore is a relatively new idea, at least in the Western world. We don't have any long-term data on it. So we're looking at this self-reported study, taking into account all the possible weaknesses of that. But on the whole, people are reporting very significant improvements in how they feel. At the very least, we can say very significant improvements in how they feel.
Yeah.
Coming off medications, particularly in cases of high blood sugar related problems, diabetes. Yeah. The one thing that does stand out is there's some questions over blood lipids. But when we look at that closely, it looks like the only potential red flag is the increase in LDL, but also there's context to that, bearing in mind that study that you showed there, which was saying that on the separate study, LDL alone in this context of lean, generally healthy people is not necessarily a risk factor for heart disease, or at least there's quite a lot of doubt there that it is.
Yeah. And the other thing that was on there was that HDLs increased and triglycerides decreased. So that HDL to triglyceride ratio is also another prominent factor in determining heart disease risk, which allegedly doesn't get talked about because they haven't found a drug to increase HDL or lower triglycerides successfully, but they have found a drug that can lower LDLs. So perhaps, it is funny. There's money to be had in lowering LDLs, but you can increase your HDLs just by eating meat. And you can lower your triglycerides just by eating meat. if you eat those on their own.
That seems like the perfect place to wrap it up. I'm going to go and do exactly that. I'm going to go and eat some
Brilliant.
meat.
Excellent.
And
Me too.
Feel no guilt or worry about it.
Yeah. I'm going for the expensive option today, ribeye steak, and I'm going to have some prawns with it. What about yourself?
Enjoy. It's going to be the trusty, fatty cut of beef mince.
Brilliant. All right. Take care. Till next time,
Okay,
Imran.
Mike. Thanks very
Cheers.
much.
Bye.